In 1947, the Austrian philosopher Frederick von Hayek organized a gathering of economists, historians, and philosophers at a Swiss spa at the base of Mont Pelerin to discuss the state of the world following World War II. The group called themselves the Mont Pelerin Society, and their main concern was the growth of government power. If governments became too strong, they believed, freedom of the individual would be at risk. The solution was a return to classical economics and a reinforcement of the free market in all aspects of life. This is the philosophy of neoliberalism. During their first meeting, the Mont Pelerin Society consisted of numerous famous figures, including Hayek, the famous economist Milton Friedman, and for a time the philosopher Karl Popper. The Mont Pelerin Society's first meeting opened with the following ominous description of the dangers facing civilization since World War II. Over large stretches of the Earth's surface, the essential conditions of human dignity and freedom have already disappeared. In others, they are under constant menace from the development of current tendencies of policy. The position of the individual and the voluntary group are progressively undermined by extensions of arbitrary power. Even that most precious possession of Western man, freedom of thought and expression, is threatened by the spread of creeds which, claiming the privilege of tolerance when in the position of a minority, seek only to establish a position of power in which they can suppress and obliterate all views but their own. In the East, communism and socialism were seen as rising threats which risked obliterating the ideals of the free market and private property. Without these two bedrock institutions, they believed, it was difficult to imagine a society in which freedom may be effectively preserved. Instead, there needed to be a renewed commitment to the free market under capitalism. Only the free market could prevent state monopolies and the tyrannical threat of authoritarian rule. Milton Friedman wrote that many people want the government to protect the consumer. A much more urgent problem is to protect the consumer from the government. State power could only be checked by the increased power of private companies, competing for the attention of free consumers in the free market. Frederick von Hayek explained it in greater detail as follows. Our freedom of choice in a competitive society rests on the fact that if one person refuses to satisfy our wishes, we can turn to another. The theory had a complex name, Neoliberalism. To understand it, it helps to break up the words into its components, neo and liberal. The neo comes from the group's commitment to those free market principles of neoclassical economics. The liberal comes from the group's commitment to ideals of personal freedom. Together, they create a philosophy of free individuals making choices in a free market to buy and do as they wish, without the interference of the government. Instead of telling people what to do, ordering them around, or controlling them with laws, the free market would allow them to make their own decisions, but in a manner that encouraged efficiency. Neoliberal thinkers pushed the idea further, however. They believed that the free market should be introduced to all aspects of our lives, even in areas that were historically provided by the state. Instead of the government running healthcare or education, private companies were to take control of these functions to allow people to have more individual choice and freedom. The introduction of the market, they thought, would drive innovation because competitors would have to differentiate themselves from one another. Innovation would increase productivity, and this would develop higher standards of living and higher wages. This became known as Trickle-down Economics, and is usually referred to by the phrase, "a rising tide lifts all boats." Through deregulation, tax cuts, and laissez-faire economics, companies would compete and make huge profits, which would trickle down from the winners of the market to employees and their families. In practice, this did not always come to pass. Aside from a few notable exceptions, in Southeast Asia and France, for example, neoliberalism has typically led to increased income inequality, stagnant wages, and a growing gap between the rich and the poor. In the 1970s and 80s, neoliberalism went from a fringe academic idea talked about at a Swiss spa to a mainstream political movement aiming to reshape Western society. The Mont Pelerin Society started to lobby for political power to spread their ideas. They garnered financial and political support in the US from a powerful group of wealthy individuals and corporate leaders who had a vested interest in the success of the philosophy. Success came quickly and on multiple fronts. First, Frederick Hayek and Milton Friedman, the two core members of the group, won respective Nobel Prizes in economics in 1974 and 1975, boosting the reputation of neoliberal theorists significantly. Second, the theory entered the hallways of political power after two consequential elections. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister of England, and in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. Both leaders ushered in an era of neoliberal politics. Thatcher came to power with a strong mandate to reform the economy. Under the influence of Keith Joseph, a political advisor from the neoliberal think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, Thatcher attacked trade unions and social solidarity and started to privatize public assets, such as public housing. Her right to buy policy allowed people living in public housing to buy the house they lived in, transitioning it from public to private ownership. Several decades later, Britain still has a shortage of public housing stock and a huge homelessness crisis, in part caused by this policy. Privatizing the National Rail Service soon followed, under both Thatcher in part and her successor John Major, causing similar problems. Railway lines and competition are actually incompatible ideas. Only one train can arrive on a track at any one time. For multiple trains to arrive at once, in direct competition, the trains would have to have less carriages, negating the entire point of trains being a mass form of transit. The benefit of privatization is meant to be increased competition, but on a railway line, no competition can occur. Instead of lowering prices, privatizing the rail service has made the UK's trains some of the most expensive in Europe. In the US, Ronald Reagan's government adopted other neoliberal policies, including deregulation, tax cuts for the rich, budget cuts, and attacks on trade unions and professional associations. Deregulation of the banks and financial services laid the groundwork for later financial crises, while tax cuts came alongside decreased spending on public services. On both sides of the Atlantic, Reaganomics and Thatcherism, as they became known, pushed for the withdrawal of the state from public service delivery. Instead of seeing society as a collective community with collective rights, society was increasingly seen as individualistic under these theories, with people having individual rights. Margaret Thatcher put it even more bluntly when she said, "There is no such thing as a society." There are many flaws to neoliberalism as a political theory, including the risk of creating monopolies, market failures, and economic inequality. Most crucially, neoliberal philosophy can lead to the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of the elite, the winners of the market competition, who can entrench their power into a monopoly and can therefore widen the gap between the rich and the poor. When the state stops offering state services, it is actually the poor who suffer the most, the people who most rely on these services for the basic provisions of food and shelter. Private charities, generally speaking, do not have the same resources as a government to deal with these shortfalls in government services.
In reference to talking about government's role in a free society, you mentioned some of the market failures, and I think that you may have just passed over one that is of utmost importance, and that is of poverty. And in prefacing my question, I'd like to refer to what President Kennedy said, that if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. And to say that, well, we are a government of the people, and when there is a large sector of the people who are hurting, perhaps it is the responsibility of this government of the people to help out.
Well,
my question is regarding how free are the poor, how free are the unemployed, and how free are those people who are disadvantaged? Right. And so in reference to that, what is government's role?
Sure. First of all, I'm glad to see one vote for the poor. First of all, the government doesn't have any responsibility. People have responsibility. This building doesn't have responsibility. You and I have responsibility. People have responsibility. Second, the question is, how can we as people exercise our responsibility toward our fellow man most effectively? That's the problem. So far as poverty is concerned, there has never in history been a more effective machine for eliminating poverty than the free enterprise system and the free market.
Apologists of neoliberalism say that it creates wealth. By some estimates, under neoliberal regimes, extreme poverty across the globe has fallen from 44% to 9.6% from the 1980s to now. China is often pointed to as the classic case study, which shifted from a traditional communist system to a market-based economy. Albeit this is a bit misleading because they still have various controls on certain industries. Although neoliberalism is now a dominant force in modern political life, significant questions remain as to its efficacy and its effect on society. While it may decrease extreme forms of poverty, it also stops the forms of social services that lift people out of poverty and into the middle class. This video was sponsored by the Cambridge Centre for International Research. The centre aims to make academic knowledge more accessible to the general public, which is something I strongly believe in. Thanks for watching my videos. Feel free to like and subscribe to the channel and comment below to share your thoughts on neoliberalism.